They thought grief had made me small. I heard it before I even reached the front doors of the funeral home, a soft voice slipping through the cold March air like perfume I did not want on my skin. She probably doesn't even know how she's going to manage now. I did not turn around. I did not need to. I already knew that voice belonged to my daughter-in-law, Vanessa, and I already knew the tone she saved for moments when she wanted to sound concerned while making sure everyone heard the insult beneath it. I kept walking, one careful step after another, my low black heels clicking against the stone path, my gloved hand wrapped around the strap of my handbag, my spine so straight it almost hurt. My husband, Thomas Carter, was being honored inside with white lilies, polished wood, and a string quartet he would have said was too expensive, and somehow the room had already begun treating me like a burden no one had budgeted for. The funeral home was the kind of place that made sorrow look elegant. Tall windows, cream-colored walls, brass sconces glowing softly against framed watercolor landscapes, fresh flowers arranged with the kind of restraint money buys when it wants to look tasteful instead of loud. Thomas would have appreciated that. He hated vulgar displays. He believed the deepest things in life should be handled with quiet hands. That morning, I had dressed the same way I had lived beside him for 42 years. Simply, carefully, and without needing anyone's approval. A black wool dress, my mother's pearl earrings, my wedding ring. No diamonds, no bright lipstick, no performance. Just dignity. But dignity is invisible to people who only know how to measure value in what flashes. As soon as I stepped into the receiving room, conversations softened around me in that artificial way people think passes for kindness. Heads tilted, smiles thinned. A few women I had known for years reached for my hand and held it just a moment too long, not because they loved me more than they had yesterday, but because they had already decided I was fragile now. One man from Thomas's club gave me a look so carefully sympathetic it bordered on patronizing. Another asked, in a voice full of rehearsed concern, whether I had family helping me with things. As if I were already halfway folded into some smaller life. As if the woman who had built a home, raised a son, hosted business dinners, balanced books, managed moves, buried parents, recovered from losses, and held a family together with her bare hands could not possibly survive 1 week without being supervised. Vanessa stood near the floral arrangement at the center of the room, dressed in a fitted black coat with a silk scarf knotted neatly at her throat, one hand resting on Daniel's arm as though she were the widow and not the woman married to my son. Her expression was perfect, sad but not ruined, tender but not swollen from crying. She knew how to arrange her face for an audience. When she saw me, she crossed the room with the same careful speed she used at charity luncheons, quick enough to look attentive, slow enough to be seen. "Evelyn," she said, touching my elbow lightly. "There you are. I was just telling everyone how strong you've been through all this." Her voice floated, light and polished, and several people turned toward us at once. "I know the adjustment is going to be hard," she added, lowering her tone just enough to sound intimate, while keeping it perfectly audible, especially with all the practical changes that come after something like this. Practical changes. She let the phrase hang there delicately, like lace over something ugly. I looked at her and saw exactly what she was doing. She was planting an idea. Not openly. Vanessa was too skilled for that. She was suggesting, gently and publicly, that I was about to become a problem to solve. That my life had been held up entirely by Thomas and now, with him gone, the floor beneath me had vanished. Daniel stood beside her in his dark suit, tie slightly crooked, face pale from lack of sleep or lack of courage. I could not tell which. He met my eyes for half a second, then looked past me toward the guest book. That was the first clean cut of the day, and in some ways it hurt more than Vanessa's little performance. Cruelty from a daughter-in-law can be managed. Silence from your own son settles deeper. "Thank you," I said, and nothing more. I watched the smallest flicker cross Vanessa's face. She had expected softness, perhaps confusion, perhaps gratitude. What unsettled women, like Vanessa, was not anger. They could work with anger. They knew how to calm it publicly and mock it privately. What unsettled them was control. The service had not yet begun, and already I could feel the room arranging itself around a story I had not told. Poor Evelyn, left behind, dependent, diminished, uncertain. A woman to be pitied. A woman to be managed. A woman whose future would now be discussed by other people in lowered voices over coffee and finger sandwiches. I took my place near the front, beside the row reserved for family, and as the quartet began to play, I looked at Thomas's photograph displayed among the white flowers. His smile in the picture was the same one he wore when he knew something no one else in the room did. For one brief moment, through the perfume, the whispers, the polished condolences, and the unbearable weight of losing him, I felt something colder than grief settle into place inside me. Let them think I was alone. Let them think I was frightened. Let them think I had no idea what was coming next. I folded my hands in my lap, lifted my chin, and said nothing at all. The service ended in a blur of organ music, polished condolences, and the faint scent of lilies beginning to turn heavy in the warm room. People rose slowly from the pews, smoothing jackets, reaching for tissues, checking their phones only after they thought no one could see. Grief has a way of revealing character in small gestures. Some people moved toward me with genuine softness, touching my hand, saying Thomas had been one of the good ones, that he would be missed, that they were praying for me. Others offered that careful kind of sympathy that is less about comfort and more about placing you in a smaller category. I could hear it in their voices. I could see it in the way their eyes drifted over my shoulder, already searching for the next conversation. I thanked each of them with the same calm expression, the same even tone, and I let them tell themselves whatever story made them feel generous. Vanessa had arranged a private reception in the adjoining room, a spread of coffee, tea, sparkling water, and trays of food no one truly tasted. Small sandwiches with the crusts trimmed off, lemon bars dusted with powdered sugar, silver urns of coffee lined up on a linen-covered table like a row of polished promises. Thomas would have hated the fuss, but he would have understood the performance behind it. He had spent enough years in business to know that people rarely gather around loss without bringing appetite of some kind. I stood near the far end of the room, one hand resting lightly against the back of an empty chair, and watched the currents form. Vanessa moved through the guests as if she had been born for this exact role, pausing just long enough at each cluster to receive condolences, lower her eyes, and mention how difficult the coming weeks would be for the family. Not for me, for the family. That was a distinction she made with great skill. Daniel trailed beside her, nodding when he should nod, shaking hands when he should shake hands, carrying the shell of a son, but none of the weight. At one point an older woman from church leaned close to me and said, "It is a blessing that Daniel and Vanessa are there to help you make decisions now. Help me make decisions." I looked at her and almost smiled. "That is kind of you," I said, because correcting people in public is wasted effort when they have already volunteered to misunderstand you. Across the room, I saw Vanessa glance toward me just as she guided two women toward the refreshments. Her face held that same polished concern, but her mouth sharpened at the corners when she thought no one was looking. She was enjoying herself. Not the funeral itself, perhaps, but the shift in gravity. She could feel the room leaning. She could feel people beginning to place her at the center of practical matters, at the center of the future, at the center of authority she had not earned. A few minutes later, I heard my name in the lowered, sympathetic tone people use when they want to discuss you as though you are both fragile and already absent. I turned slightly, not enough to be obvious, and saw Vanessa standing near the coffee service with one of Thomas's distant cousins and a woman from the country club. She never really handled any of the big financial things, Vanessa said softly, stirring her tea without drinking it. Thomas took care of all that. I just worry she is going to be overwhelmed. The cousin gave a solemn nod, the kind women use when they are pretending not to enjoy a piece of gossip. Of course, she murmured. These things can be complicated. Vanessa sighed, delicate and regretful. Daniel and I are just trying to be realistic. She may need to downsize, maybe move somewhere easier. Something more manageable. There is no shame in that. There it was. Not a direct insult. Vanessa was much too refined for anything so clumsy. She preferred the American art of smiling while rearranging someone else's life. Downsize. Manageable. Realistic. Words that sound responsible while stripping a person of place, history, and standing. I felt something cold and precise settle behind my ribs. It was not anger, not exactly. Anger is hot and noisy and often foolish. This was clarity. Vanessa was not improvising. She had been preparing this narrative well before the flowers arrived and the obituary was printed. She wanted witnesses. She wanted consensus. She wanted the room to accept, gently and all at once, that I was entering a stage of life where other people would take over. I picked up a cup of coffee I did not want and crossed the room with the same measured pace I had used all morning. When I reached them, Vanessa turned with that graceful little start she did so well. "Evelyn," she said warmly, "I was just saying we all want to make sure you are supported." I looked at her, then at the women beside her. "That is thoughtful," I said. My voice stayed soft enough that they had to lean in a fraction. Thomas always appreciated planning ahead. I let that sentence rest there. Simple, true, entirely harmless on the surface. But I saw the faint flicker in Vanessa's eyes, the quick calculation, the small uncertainty. She did not know what Thomas had planned, and it unsettled her to be reminded that there were years of my marriage she had never been invited to understand. Daniel appeared a moment later, as if summoned by discomfort rather than duty. "Mom," he said, too quickly, "are you doing all right?" I studied his face. He had Thomas's height, Thomas's dark hair gone softer at the temples, and none of his father's steadiness. "I am doing exactly as well as can be expected at your father's funeral," I said. He swallowed and looked away first. Again, around us the room continued its quiet theater. Cups clinked against saucers. A chair scraped lightly across the hardwood floor. Someone near the doorway laughed once, then caught themselves and lowered their voice. Vanessa touched Daniel's sleeve, a small proprietary gesture, and I suddenly understood something that should have hurt more than it did. She had mistaken his weakness for a doorway, and he had mistaken her ambition for strength. Together, they were building confidence out of assumptions neither of them had bothered to verify. I set my untouched coffee on a side table and reached for my handbag. My fingers brushed the smooth leather. Then the folded note inside from Martin Hale slipped to me just before the service began, asking me to see him privately before I left. I had not read more than the first line, but I had recognized his handwriting and understood enough. Thomas had not gone into death unprepared. The room around me still saw a widow in pearls and black wool, quiet with sorrow and uncertain of what came next. Let Vanessa go on placing me into the future she had selected on my behalf. Let Daniel stand beside her and call it practicality. I lifted my chin, offered one more composed nod to the women in front of me, and moved toward the hallway where Martin was waiting. While behind me the whispers continued arranging my life into something smaller than it had ever been. Martin Hale was waiting in the side hallway just beyond the reception room, standing beneath a framed watercolor of some peaceful New England harbor that looked as though nothing difficult had ever happened there. He had removed his overcoat, and his charcoal suit was as precise as ever, not a wrinkle at the cuffs, not a hair out of place. Martin had been Thomas's attorney for nearly 20 years, but more than that, he had been one of the very few men my husband trusted to speak plainly. He did not offer me the soft, melting expression everyone else had been wearing all afternoon. For that alone, I was grateful. He simply inclined his head and said, "Mrs. Carter." "Martin," I said. The hallway was quiet except for the muffled clink of dishes and the low hum of voices drifting from the reception room. It felt like standing just outside a stage play and hearing actors miss their cues. Martin glanced once toward the doorway, then handed me a cream-colored envelope, sealed and marked in Thomas's handwriting. My breath caught for the first time that day in a way I could not disguise. Thomas's handwriting had always been firm, deliberate, slanting slightly to the right, as though even his words were moving toward a decision. I traced my gloved finger over my name without opening the envelope. "He left instructions," Martin said. "Specific ones." I assumed he might. My voice came out steadier than I felt. Martin watched me for a moment, measuring, the way attorneys do when they are deciding how much truth a person can hold at once. "The family believes they understand the structure of his estate," he said carefully. "They do not." I let out one slow breath. The air in that narrow hallway smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper. "How much do they know?" "Enough to be confident," he said. "Not enough to be correct." Despite everything, I almost smiled. That sounded like Thomas, not only in strategy, but in humor. He had always said the most dangerous people in any room were the ones who mistook assumption for access. I looked down at the envelope again and felt a weight much greater than the paper itself. Grief had wrapped itself around every hour of the past week, but beneath it was something else now. Not relief. Not yet. Something closer to recognition. Thomas had seen this coming. Or at least he had seen enough of human nature to know what death does to a room full of people who have learned to confuse closeness with entitlement. There is a meeting scheduled for Monday, Martin continued. Preliminary review of the estate documents. Daniel believes it is mostly procedural. Vanessa has been active. The pause before the last word was so slight that another person might have missed it. I did not. Active how? I asked. Martin's expression did not change, but his voice became even flatter. Questions about the residence. About account access. About personal property. About whether certain decisions can be accelerated. There it was again, that polished language people use when they want to disguise appetite as efficiency. I pictured Vanessa near the coffee service, one elegant hand wrapped around a china cup, arranging my future in sentences that sounded helpful if you were foolish enough to listen only to the adjectives. Downsize. Manageable. Supported. Accelerated. It was extraordinary how many ugly things could be wrapped in tasteful vocabulary. And Daniel? I asked. Martin adjusted his cuff, buying himself a second. He has not asked many questions directly. That answer landed harder than if he had said Daniel was innocent. Silence is its own form of participation, and every mother knows the difference between confusion and avoidance. Daniel was not leading this, but he was not stopping it either. He was letting events gather around him the way weak men often do, hoping that passivity will spare them responsibility while they still benefit from the outcome. Martin lowered his voice another degree. Before Thomas passed, he made several revisions. He was very clear that some information was not to be discussed until certain conditions were met. He anticipated pressure. My fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. From whom? He held my gaze. He did not name anyone specifically in the final instruction. But he did say this. If they begin deciding your life for you, do not correct them too soon. For a moment, the hallway disappeared. I was back in our kitchen 6 months earlier, late autumn sunlight falling across the counter, Thomas standing by the coffee maker in his navy sweater, watching the backyard through the window while he stirred his cup. He had looked tired that morning, though he would not have admitted it. People show themselves when they think the cost is gone, he had said. I remembered asking what on earth he meant, and he had only smiled, that quiet half-smile he wore when he was fitting pieces together faster than anyone else in the room. At the time, I thought he was talking about business. I understood now that he was talking about family. What are you telling me, Martin? I asked. He gave the smallest nod toward the envelope in my hand. I am telling you that Thomas did not leave you exposed. I am also telling you that he expected appearances to shift quickly after the funeral. He prepared for that. From the reception room, I heard Vanessa's laugh, soft and brief, cut short the instant she remembered where she was. It floated through the doorway like a dropped piece of jewelry. Martin heard it too. Neither of us commented. Should I read this? Now, I asked. Not here, he said. Take it home. Read it when you are alone. Home. The word struck me with a force I had not been prepared for. Home was where Thomas's slippers still sat beside the bed. Home was the study with the green lamp and the legal pads full of his square handwriting. Home was the cedar closet where his winter coat still hung. Home was the one place in the world where grief did not need good manners. And apparently, if Vanessa had her way, home was already being measured, discussed, and reduced to an asset awaiting redistribution. I slid the envelope into my handbag. Monday, I said. Monday, Martin confirmed. He hesitated, then added, Mrs. Carter, I would advise you not to underestimate how much confidence they are drawing from incomplete information. I do not, I said. In fact, I think that may be the most useful thing about them. The first real change in his expression all day was a flicker of approval. Thomas believed you would say something very close to that. I turned toward the reception room again, toward the voices, the flowers, the relatives, the practiced concern. For the first time since morning, the scene felt different to me. Not kinder, not less painful, just clearer. They thought I was standing at the edge of my own life waiting for instructions. They thought widowhood had reduced me to sentiment and soft shoes and dependency. They thought money moved automatically toward the loudest claim, the youngest face, the people who hovered closest to the paperwork. They did not know about the revisions. They did not know about Thomas's final precautions. They did not know what sat silently between my handbag and my ribs, folded into one cream-colored envelope with my name written in the hand of the man they were already underestimating in death. "Go back in," Martin said quietly. "Let them keep talking." I nodded once and stepped toward the doorway. As I reached the threshold, I saw Vanessa across the room, her hand resting possessively on Daniel's forearm, her head tilted toward a pair of guests as she spoke with grave tenderness about the difficult road ahead. She looked up and met my eyes. For one brief second, I let her see nothing. No confusion, no fear, no gratitude, only stillness. Then I walked back into the room, carrying my sorrow like a crown no one there knew how to read. By the time I left the funeral home, the sky had turned the color of old silver, low and heavy over the parking lot, and the air carried that damp chill that settles into your coat sleeves and stays there. I drove myself home because I could not bear the thought of sitting in the passenger seat while someone else handled the road, someone else chose the speed, someone else spoke into the silence I needed in order to think. Thomas's Mercedes moved smoothly through the late afternoon traffic, all polished restraint and quiet engineering, and for a few miles I simply kept my eyes on the road and let the weight of the day arrange itself inside me. At every red light, I could hear fragments of the reception replaying in my head. Vanessa speaking in that soft, generous voice about support. The cousins nodding as though they had been appointed caretakers of my future. Daniel asking if I was all right in the tone one uses with a stranger in a waiting room. They had all behaved as if widowhood had erased half my mind and most of my authority before the flowers had even begun to fade. When I turned into the long drive of our house, the stone columns at the entrance came into view through the bare branches of the oaks, and for one terrible second I nearly stopped the car. Home had never looked so unchanged, which was another way of saying it had never looked so cruel. The porch lanterns had come on automatically in the early dark. The brass knocker Thomas insisted on polishing himself still caught the light. The front windows glowed softly against the dusk, calm and steady, and utterly unaware that the man who had chosen every proportion of that house was never going to walk through the front door again. I sat in the driveway for a moment after turning off the engine, both hands resting on the steering wheel, and let the silence gather around me. Then I took the envelope from my handbag and held it in my lap. My name in Thomas's handwriting seemed at once intimate and formal, as though he had reached toward me from a distance he knew I could not cross yet. Inside the house, the quiet was different. From the funeral home quiet. It was not decorated. It did not perform. It was simply the absence of one familiar life from another. I set my bag on the entry table, hung my coat in the closet, and stood still in the foyer while the grandfather clock in the hall marked the half hour. Every object around me had a history. The umbrella stand from Charleston. The runner I had chosen after Thomas spilled coffee on the first one and claimed that was how all good decorating decisions were made. The framed black and white photograph of Daniel at age 12 with his first fishing rod, smiling up at his father as though admiration were the easiest thing in the world. I looked at that photograph longer than I intended. There had been a time when Daniel could not wait to tell me everything. A scraped knee, a bad grade, a girl from school, a dream he had after a thunderstorm. He used to come into the kitchen barefoot on Saturday mornings and ask if his father was awake yet, because he had an idea and wanted both of us to hear it. I had packed his lunches, sewn costume buttons back on before school plays, sat through fevers, paid orthodontists, balanced budgets, and kept that child moving through life with the kind of invisible labor mothers perform so well no one thinks to call it work. Later, when Thomas's business began to grow faster than any of us expected, it was I who learned where every dollar needed to go and where it should not. I knew which accounts mattered, which investments were solid, which people in our circle liked to look important, and which ones actually were. Thomas used to joke that I was the only woman in Fairfield County who could host a Christmas dinner for 24 and still notice if a quarterly statement looked strange. He said it as a joke, but he meant it as respect. I went into the kitchen, turned on the under-cabinet lights, and made tea because the action itself felt survivable. Kettle, cup, saucer, honey, though I did not use it. The ordinary mercy of a task done by hand. On the counter beside the stove sat the small blue ceramic bowl Thomas always filled with wrapped peppermints after dinner parties. It was still half full. My chest tightened, but I did not let myself fall apart. Not yet. I carried the tea to his study and closed the door behind me. The room smelled faintly of leather, cedar, and the dry paper scent of books that had been opened often. His green banker's lamp cast a warm circle over the desk. The chair behind it was slightly pushed back from where he had left it the week before he went into the hospital for the last time. Nothing in that room looked dramatic. That was the awful thing. Death does not always announce itself with broken glass. Sometimes it just leaves a reading lamp on a desk no one will use again. I sat in the armchair by the window, placed my tea on the side table, and opened the envelope. The letter inside was only 2 pages, but I knew before I reached the end that it would divide my life into before and after as cleanly as any doctor's verdict. Thomas wrote that he loved me. He wrote that he trusted me. He wrote that grief makes decent people quiet and opportunists efficient, and that I should not confuse the second thing for strength. Then he turned practical. He confirmed that several revisions had been made over the previous year, some public, some private, some timed, some conditional. He reminded me where the authority truly rested. Not with Daniel. Not with anyone standing nearest the coffin. Not with the relative who asked the boldest questions in the softest tone. With me. My hand remained perfectly steady as I read, even though my throat burned. He knew. He had seen enough in Vanessa's manner, enough in Daniel's weakness, enough in the small shifts that happen when younger people begin treating an older woman's life like an estate sale waiting for better lighting. And then I reached the line that made me set the letter down for a moment and look out into the dark yard beyond the window. The figure itself did not surprise me because I had lived beside the making of it. What struck me was the scale of silence around it. The fact that the entire room at the funeral home had looked at me and seen limitation while nearly $28 million sat protected behind decisions my husband had arranged and I could now control. I thought of Vanessa saying I might need something more manageable. I thought of the women nodding sympathetically over their coffee cups. I thought of Daniel looking away. Outside, the wind moved lightly through the trees. Inside, the lamp glowed over Thomas's desk, and the letter lay open in my lap like a final act of protection. They thought I had become smaller that day. They thought the story had narrowed. But alone in that room, with grief on one side of me and the truth on the other, I began to understand something they had missed entirely. I was not the widow at the edge of the family waiting to be placed. I was the one person in it who still knew where all the doors were. Monday arrived with the kind of pale morning light that makes expensive neighborhoods look almost modest, as if trimmed hedges and stone facades could disguise what people believe about themselves behind closed doors. I was awake before dawn, not because I had slept well, but because grief had already trained my body to stop expecting comfort. I dressed with care, the same way I always had before difficult meetings. Navy wool dress, pearl earrings, low heels, hair pinned neatly away from my face. No dramatic black this time. No sign that I intended to enter the room as a woman in collapse. In the kitchen, I made coffee and stood at the counter while it brewed, one hand resting beside Thomas's letter where I had placed it the night before. I had read it twice more after midnight, not because I needed clarity, but because I needed the sound of his mind near mine a little longer. Outside the window, the lawn was silvered with early frost. Inside, the house held that steady hush that comes just before a decision. By 9:30, I was on my way to Martin's office in Westport, a square brick building with tall windows and a lobby designed to reassure clients that old money still believed in dark wood and discretion. I arrived 5 minutes early. I always arrive 5 minutes early. Punctuality is one of the few ways a woman can assert power without saying a word, and I had learned long ago that silence, properly timed, is often more expensive than speech. Martin's receptionist greeted me with genuine warmth and led me to the conference room at the end of the hall. The table was long, polished, and severe enough to make everyone sit up straighter than they intended. A pitcher of water stood beside a neat arrangement of glasses. Legal folders were stacked in careful order at Martin's place. Sunlight fell through the windows in cool rectangles across the carpet. It was, I thought, exactly the kind of room in which people reveal themselves while pretending to discuss practical matters. Daniel and Vanessa arrived together 3 minutes later. Vanessa entered first, carrying a leather portfolio she did not need, dressed in cream and camel as if she were attending a board luncheon rather than a family estate meeting. Her expression was restrained, respectful, almost tender, but there was brightness in her eyes that did not belong to sorrow. Daniel looked tired, rumpled at the edges, his tie loosened slightly despite the hour, as though he had spent the weekend rehearsing discomfort instead of confronting it. "Mom," he said, kissing my cheek lightly. The gesture was correct in form and empty in feeling. "How are you holding up?" "I am here," I said, which was the only answer he had earned. Vanessa took the chair beside him and offered me a sympathetic smile. "I know this must all feel overwhelming," she said. "But Martin will walk us through everything." Us. Such a small word, and yet so revealing. I sat down opposite them and folded my gloves neatly beside my handbag. "I am sure he will," I said. Martin entered a moment later carrying one additional folder, thinner than the others, which he placed near his right hand without comment. The meeting began with the usual formalities. Condolences repeated in a professional tone. A summary of Thomas's publicly known holdings. The house. The business interests. The charitable commitments. A handful of personal bequests not yet discussed in detail. Vanessa listened with her head inclined slightly, pen poised over a yellow legal pad, playing the role of organized daughter-in-law with almost insulting precision. She did not interrupt often. She did not need to. She knew how to wait for the right opening and then step into it, as though she were doing everyone a favor. That moment came when Martin mentioned the family residence. "Of course," Vanessa said gently. "One of the things Daniel and I have been concerned about is making sure Evelyn is not burdened with too much too soon." Burdened. There was that word again, dressed in silk. Daniel gave the faintest nod, eyes lowered to the table, as if agreement might be less shameful when not made at full volume. Martin said nothing. He merely looked at her over the rim of his glasses and waited. Vanessa continued, encouraged by the silence. "The house is beautiful, but it is a great deal to manage for one person. The upkeep alone, the property taxes, the staff. We were thinking it might be wise to discuss whether a transition plan should happen sooner rather than later. Something simpler. Something more practical." I turned my water glass once on the table without lifting it. My face remained calm, but inside me every line of Thomas's letter sharpened. "If they begin deciding your life for you, do not correct them too soon." "A transition plan," Martin repeated. "Yes," Vanessa said, warming now to her own reasonableness. "I am only saying this out of concern. The last thing any of us want is for Evelyn to feel pressured once the realities set in." The realities. There are women who insult you by raising their voices. Vanessa preferred to do it by lowering hers. She placed me in a future of reduced rooms, reduced choices, reduced authority, all while appearing compassionate enough to be thanked for it. And which realities would those be? I asked. My tone was so even that Daniel finally looked up. Vanessa turned to me with an expression of almost maternal patience, which would have been laughable if it had not been so offensive. "The financial adjustments, of course. The estate process. Liquidity. Long-term maintenance. These things can become complicated very quickly." She said liquidity as though merely pronouncing the word made her qualified to rearrange my life. Martin rested both hands on the table. "Mrs. Carter," he said to Vanessa, and the formal address cooled the room by at least 10 degrees. "Before we move further into recommendations, perhaps it would be best to clarify what authority exists and where." Vanessa's smile held, but only just. "Of course," she said. "That is all I am trying to do." Martin opened one of the folders and reviewed several pages in silence. The room grew still in the way rooms do when confidence begins to sense danger but has not yet identified its source. Daniel shifted in his chair. Vanessa tapped her pen once, then stopped herself. I said nothing. That was the hardest part for people like them to understand. Silence is not always uncertainty. Sometimes it is investment. Martin lifted another document, then placed it back down. "There are several structures within the estate that were revised over the past year," he said. "Some of those revisions affect not only distribution, but control." Vanessa's pen remained motionless above the paper. "Control of what?" she asked. "Of decisions," Martin said. "Residence. Timing. Asset access. Disbursements. Strategic holdings." Daniel frowned, finally alert enough to hear a word that sounded like consequence. "I thought Dad had already simplified most of that," he said. Martin looked at him kindly, which somehow made the answer worse. "Your father simplified nothing for the benefit of assumption." I kept my eyes on my hands, neatly folded on the table, but I could feel Vanessa's attention turn toward me with the sharpness of a blade hidden inside velvet. The performance was slipping. She did not yet know how badly. but she could sense that the room was no longer arranged to flatter her. Then, through the half-open conference room door, her voice drifted back to me from 15 minutes earlier when she had stepped into the hallway to take what she thought was a private call. I had gone to the ladies' room at the same time and paused just beyond the corner when I heard her. "Once the paperwork clears," she had said in a bright whisper, "she will not have much say. Daniel will handle the practical side, and I will make sure things move quickly. The house will probably be sold before summer." She had laughed then, soft and confident. No, she does not really understand what any of this costs. I had stood there with one hand on the marble counter, looking at my own reflection in the mirror, and something inside me had gone very still. Not because the words shocked me. By then, I expected greed. What chilled me was the certainty. The clean, effortless certainty with which she discussed erasing me from my own life. Back in the conference room, I looked at Vanessa across the polished wood and saw that same certainty flicker once behind her eyes before she smoothed it away. She thought the paperwork was the story. She thought proximity was the same as power. She thought she had already crossed the finish line because she had spent the weekend furnishing the victory in her mind. I sat straighter in my chair and let my gaze settle on Martin. "Please continue," I said. And for the first time since Thomas died, I watched someone else in the room realize that I was not there to be managed. I was there to listen very carefully while other people showed me exactly who they had become. Martin did not rush. That was one of the reasons Thomas trusted him. Men who enjoy power often dramatize it, but Martin preferred precision. He opened the thinner folder he had set aside earlier and adjusted the page only once before speaking, as though even paper should not be moved more than necessary. "Over the last 12 months, he said, Thomas Carter executed a series of amendments, transfers, and directives designed to preserve continuity and prevent unauthorized influence during the estate transition." Vanessa's expression remained composed, but I saw the first real crack in it when she heard the phrase unauthorized influence. It landed exactly where it needed to. Daniel leaned back in his chair and frowned at the documents in front of Martin, as if concentration alone might turn them into something more convenient. "I do not understand," he said. "Dad never mentioned any of that." Martin folded his hands. "Your father mentioned many things selectively." The sunlight had shifted by then, moving in long pale bands across the conference table, catching the rim of Vanessa's water glass and the gold clasp on her portfolio. Everything in the room looked orderly, expensive, civilized. That is the most dangerous setting for a family betrayal. Not because it is louder there, but because everyone assumes cruelty will arrive dressed more obviously. In rooms like that, people say the coldest things in warm voices. Vanessa gave a small, practiced smile. "I am sure Thomas had reasons," she said. "We all know how private he was. I just think it would help everyone if we focused on practical solutions instead of making this more complicated than it needs to be." Practical solutions. She kept reaching for that phrase the way some women reach for prayer beads, hoping repetition would make virtue out of self-interest. Martin turned one page. "Then let us be practical," he said. "The residence remains under Evelyn Carter's exclusive control unless she chooses otherwise. No sale discussions. No transition planning. No occupancy changes, and no restructuring conversations are to proceed without her express written authorization." There was a very small silence after that. The kind of silence that reveals more than an argument ever could. Vanessa blinked once, slowly, and set her pen down. Daniel looked from Martin to me, then back again. "Exclusive control," he repeated. "For how long?" Martin's voice stayed neutral. "Indefinitely, unless Mrs. Carter directs otherwise." Daniel turned toward me with a puzzled look that might have become embarrassment if he had let himself feel it fully. "Mom, I thought maybe after everything, you would want help with the place." "Help is not the same as transfer," I said. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Vanessa stepped in before the silence could deepen around him. "No one is trying to take anything from Evelyn," she said, her tone calm and lightly wounded now, as though the room had somehow become unfair to her. "We are only trying to think ahead. It would be irresponsible not to." Martin did not look at her this time. He looked at the document. "Thomas anticipated that language," he said. "He left written instructions concerning recommendations framed as concern when made before all controlling information was known." That sentence was so exact, so devastatingly specific, that even I felt its elegance like a blade sliding neatly into place. Vanessa's face did not fall apart. Women like her do not lose composure in public unless they have no training at all. But the warmth left her expression. Not dramatically, just enough that the room no longer mistook her for the most caring person in it. "What controlling information?" she asked. Martin lifted his eyes at last. "We will come to that." Daniel rubbed his forehead. "This is ridiculous," he said quietly. "Why would Dad structure things like some kind of trap?" I looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a villain but something almost sadder. A man nearing 50 who still believed his father's foresight was an inconvenience if it interrupted his assumptions. "Your father did not build traps," I said. "He built safeguards." Daniel shifted in his chair. Vanessa remained very still. The room had changed now. Not outwardly. The water still caught the light. The folders still lay stacked in neat legal order. Traffic still moved somewhere below the windows. But the balance had shifted. Confidence had begun draining from one side of the table and collecting, quietly, on the other. Martin continued. In addition to residential authority, Thomas created a private decision framework regarding strategic assets, discretionary disbursements, and certain protected accounts. Those mechanisms are not activated by proximity, family enthusiasm, or informal expectation. They are activated by designated authority. Vanessa let out the smallest breath and picked up her pen again. Not to write, I realized, but to have something in her hand. "And who has designated authority?" she asked. Martin did not answer immediately. He allowed the question to remain in the air for half a beat, which gave it the weight of a fact rather than a fight. "Evelyn Carter," he said. Daniel stared. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the pen so subtly that anyone who did not know how to watch women would have missed it. "I do not see how that is possible," she said. "No offense, Evelyn, but Thomas handled almost everything." There it was. At last, not wrapped in tea and sympathy, not cushioned by concern. Just the plain insult beneath all the softer ones. No offense. As if those two words had ever protected anyone from what came after them. I folded my hands more neatly in my lap. "That is interesting," I said, "because I seem to remember balancing expansion budgets while you were still deciding whether hydrangeas or peonies looked better in wedding centerpieces." Daniel looked down at the table. Martin said nothing. Vanessa's cheeks changed color by one careful shade. She recovered quickly, but not quickly enough. "I only meant that Thomas had more experience with the larger financial structures," she said. "Of course he did," I replied. "That is why he married someone who knew how to protect them." Another silence. Heavier this time. More honest. I thought then of all the years people had mistaken my discretion for ignorance. It is a common American error. A woman who does not parade her competence is assumed not to have any. A wife who lets her husband speak first is presumed not to understand the figures. A mother who keeps a gracious table is thought to know only place settings and recipes, not contracts, timing, leverage, and risk. Thomas had never made that mistake. He knew exactly what I saw because I had spent decades standing beside him while other people talked too. Soon, Martin opened the final section of the folder. "There is one more point that should be clarified before this meeting continues," he said. The air in the room felt different against my skin, thinner somehow, charged. Vanessa sat straighter. Daniel's hands were flat on the table now, his wedding band catching the light each time his fingers moved. Certain holdings were intentionally removed from casual family discussion and placed within a protected structure not subject to presumptive inheritance conversations. Vanessa stared at him. "What holdings?" she asked again, and this time the smoothness was gone. Martin glanced at me only once, a brief professional acknowledgement that what came next was mine to reveal or defer. I remembered Thomas's line in the letter. "Do not correct them too soon." I had obeyed it at the funeral. I had obeyed it through the weekend. I had obeyed it while Vanessa discussed selling my home before summer. But now the room had shown me enough. I looked across the polished table at the woman who had spent days rehearsing my reduction and at the son who had allowed it, because passivity is easier than courage. Then I turned to Martin and said, very calmly, "You may continue." Martin turned one page, then another, as if the next sentence were nothing more than a matter of orderly sequence, and not the moment the room would divide itself into before and after. "These holdings," he said, "were placed into a protected structure approximately 11 months ago and revised again 6 months later. They are not governed by ordinary assumptions regarding access, timing, or family expectation. They are governed by direct authority and survivorship provisions established by Thomas Carter. Vanessa did not move. The stillness itself gave her away. Women who have spent their lives managing impressions know that sudden silence can look more dangerous than speech, so they usually keep their expressions in motion. A slight nod, a sympathetic blink, a softening of the mouth. Vanessa did none of those things. She simply looked at Martin as if she could force the next sentence to arrive in her favor. Daniel cleared his throat. "What exactly are we talking about?" he asked. Martin answered with the same careful neutrality. "A portfolio of strategic holdings, protected reserves, and associated cash positions currently valued at approximately $28 million. No one spoke. Even the light in the room seemed to pause. $28 million is a figure too large for most people to hear cleanly the first time. It does not land as money at first. It lands as atmosphere. Wait. Distance. A rearranging of everything that had just been said. Daniel stared at Martin, then at me, then back again as if one of us might smile and reveal that this was a misunderstanding, an accounting error, some technical category that did not really mean what it sounded like. Vanessa was the first to recover enough to speak. "I am sorry," she said, and now there was no warmth left in her voice at all, only control under strain. "Did you say 28 million? Martin folded his hands. "I did." Her pen slipped once between her fingers and struck the yellow legal pad with a soft click. "And where exactly has this been?" The question was meant for Martin, but it was shaped like an accusation toward me. I turned my eyes to her and let the silence answer first. Then I said, "Exactly where Thomas intended it to be." Daniel let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was no humor in it, only disbelief fraying into panic. "Mom, why did nobody tell me?" It was such a child's question that for a moment I nearly looked around for the boy from the old photograph in our foyer. Why did nobody tell me? Not what did I miss? Not why did Dad decide that? Not what does this mean for you? Only the startled complaint of a man discovering that the room had not been built around him after all. "Because it was not yours to be told," I said. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, but there was nothing relaxed in the motion. "This seems highly irregular," she said. "No," Martin replied. "It is highly intentional." She looked at him sharply. "With all respect, Martin, decisions of that magnitude affect the entire family." "No," he said again, and this time even Daniel flinched at the firmness in his voice. "They affect the estate. The authority over these specific holdings belongs to Mrs. Carter." I picked up my water glass and took a single sip. Across the table, Vanessa's eyes moved over me differently now. Not with pity, not with polished concern, not even with open resentment. This was calculation forced to reorganize itself in real time. She was going back over every conversation from the funeral, every suggestion she had made, every witness she had cultivated, trying to determine how much damage had already been done and whether any of it could still be repaired. It could not. That was the beauty of restraint. Once people reveal themselves under the assumption that you are powerless, they cannot climb back into innocence when the numbers change. Daniel rubbed his face with one hand. "I do not understand why Dad would keep something like this secret." "He did not keep it secret from the person he trusted," I said. Another silence. This one cut deeper because it left no room for confusion. Daniel dropped his hand slowly. There was at last, not just surprise but shame, though still not enough of it. I could see him trying to decide which feeling ought to lead. Hurt pride, confusion, loyalty to Vanessa, the dull ache of having been measured by his father and found weaker than he wanted to believe. Vanessa straightened a stack of papers that did not need straightening. "No one here has acted in bad faith," she said carefully. "We have all been trying to support Evelyn during an impossible time." Martin's expression did not change, but his eyes moved once toward me, then back to the table. He was giving me the floor if I wanted it. I set down my glass and folded my hands. "Support," I said, "is an interesting word." Vanessa held my gaze. "I meant it sincerely." "Did you?" I asked. "Because from where I sat, you spent the funeral introducing me to my own future as if I had not yet arrived in it. You spoke about downsizing my life before my husband had even been buried. You spoke about burden and management and practical transitions while looking directly at people who were more than happy to believe I had become helpless overnight." Daniel shifted in his chair. "Mom, maybe that is not what she meant." I turned to him. Then perhaps she should have meant something better. For the first time since the meeting began, Vanessa lost the rhythm of her breathing. It was slight, but visible. I was trying to be realistic, she said. Realistic, I repeated. You told someone in the hallway that once the paperwork cleared, I would not have much say. You said the house would probably be sold before summer. You said I did not understand what any of this costs. Daniel turned toward her, so quickly his chair gave a small scrape against the carpet. Vanessa. She looked at him, then back at me, and I saw the exact moment she realized denial would only make her smaller. I was speaking hypothetically, she said. No, I replied. You were speaking confidently. That is different. Martin remained silent, which was wise. Lawyers understand that some truths are better delivered without legal language around them. Daniel looked stricken now, but not purely because of what she had said. He looked stricken because he knew I was right, and because some part of him had likely allowed himself to imagine the same future, only in softer terms. A smaller house for mother. Fewer responsibilities. Easier for everyone. Cleaner. The American talent for dressing greed in organizational language is almost limitless. Vanessa drew herself up. I think it is unfair to suggest concern equals opportunism. Concern, I said, arrives with questions. Opportunism arrives with plans. That settled over the room with the finality of a door closing. Outside the windows, traffic moved along the avenue in ordinary Monday patterns. Somewhere down the hall a phone rang and was answered on the second ring. The world, as always, continued with vulgar indifference to private humiliation. But inside that conference room, the arrangement had changed completely. The widow they had expected to guide gently toward a smaller life was seated upright in navy wool, calm as a judge, while $28 million in a legal structure designed by her husband stood silently at her back. I looked at Daniel, then at Vanessa, and felt no triumph. Triumph is too bright a word for what comes after betrayal. What I felt was colder and cleaner than that. Recognition. They had shown me exactly who they were when they thought I had no leverage. And now, for the first time, they understood that I had never needed to mention the money for it to matter. No one reached for the water after that. The glasses remained where they were, half full and untouched, catching the pale morning light like small, decorative lies. Martin closed the folder in front of him, not because the meeting was over, but because the essential truth was now on the table and everything that followed would be about character rather than paperwork. Daniel looked older than he had an hour earlier. Not wiser, just older. Some men age quickly in moments when they are forced to see themselves from the outside. Vanessa, on the other hand, seemed to grow sharper. Not louder, not dramatic, just more exact around the edges, as if the removal of illusion had revealed the harder architecture beneath her manners. I think we need to take a step back, she said at last. Her tone had regained some of its polish, but not the warmth. Everyone here is emotional. Thomas just passed away. Things may have been said in grief that are now being interpreted too harshly. I almost admired the attempt. There is a certain American elegance in trying to relabel ambition as stress once it has been exposed in daylight. No, I said. Grief did not create what I heard. It only removed your reason to hide it well. Daniel exhaled and stared at the table. Vanessa, he said quietly, did you really say the house would be sold before summer? She turned to him with controlled disbelief, as if the betrayal in the room were not what she had done, but that he would ask her directly. I was trying to anticipate possibilities, she said. That is what adults do. Adults, I said, also know the difference between planning and presuming. Martin said nothing. He had become very still, which is what competent men do when a room begins producing truth without assistance. Vanessa placed both hands flat on the table. Her wedding ring flashed once beneath the window light. Fine, she said. Let us speak plainly then. You have made me sound greedy for trying to think ahead, but someone had to. Daniel is grieving. You are grieving. Thomas handled the larger financial structures. I stepped in because I did not want everything to collapse into confusion. I looked at her for a long moment. Nothing was collapsing, I said. You mistook silence for vacancy. Something in her expression tightened. That is not fair. It is exact. Daniel pressed his fingers to his temple. Can we please stop talking like this? He asked. His voice held that weak, pleading note I had heard too often during his marriage, the sound of a man asking for peace when what he really means is comfort. No, I said. We cannot stop talking like this, because this is the first honest conversation anyone in this room has had since your father died. That landed. He looked at me with a mixture of hurt and helplessness, but I had gone beyond the point of softening things for his convenience. A mother can spend decades cushioning a son from discomfort and still be astonished by how little that prepares him for truth. Vanessa lifted her chin. "What exactly do you want from us?" she asked. It was the wrong question, and I think she knew at the moment it left her mouth. One implied negotiation. It implied that the scene might still be reorganized around her ability to offer the right expression, the right apology, the right strategic retreat. I folded my gloves once, neatly, and laid them beside my handbag. "I want nothing from you," I said. "That is what seems to trouble you." The room went quiet again. Not the brittle quiet of social embarrassment. Something deeper. A quiet in which each person begins hearing their own motives too clearly to interrupt them. Martin opened a separate document and slid it gently toward me. "Mrs. Carter," he said, "there are several discretionary decisions that can be addressed now or deferred until you choose." I glanced down at the summary. There were properties, reserves, distributions, protected instructions, private philanthropic commitments Thomas and I had discussed over candlelight and legal pads long before anyone else imagined they had a voice in them. The sight of those pages did not make me feel rich. It made me feel married. Known. Defended. Thomas had not simply accumulated money. He had built structures around trust. And in the end, he had placed that trust where it belonged. Daniel noticed the papers. "So what happens now?" he asked. The question was finally directed to the right person. I turned to him. "Now," I said, "the things your father arranged will proceed exactly as he intended." Vanessa's eyes narrowed by the smallest degree. "And where does that leave family?" she asked. There it was again, the use of a sacred word as if it were a legal argument. Family. As though blood or marriage entitled anyone to pre-written access. As though the word itself should make me forget the funeral whispers. The pitying looks, the hallway phone call, the effortless certainty with which she had planned my reduction. "Family," I said, "does not begin at the reading of an estate document." Daniel looked stricken again. "Mom, I never wanted you to feel pushed out." "You did not need to want it," I said. "You only needed to allow it." He looked down. I watched the sentence settle into him, and for the first time I thought he might actually carry it rather than explain it away. Vanessa was less willing to sit inside discomfort. "This is becoming personal," she said. "No," I replied. "It has always been personal. You simply assumed the paperwork would protect you from that fact." Martin cleared his throat softly. "There are practical matters still to review," he said, giving the room a narrow bridge back to composure. "Residence authority, account protections, trustee coordination, and scheduling for follow-up." I nodded. "Proceed." Vanessa drew back slightly in her chair. I could see her measuring the limits now, trying to determine whether she still had angles left. There are always people who believe every closed door must have a side entrance if they are clever enough. But cleverness is only useful when the foundation is uncertain, and Thomas had built this one in stone. Martin outlined the next steps with legal precision. No one would access the protected holdings without my authorization. No one would initiate sale conversations regarding the residence. No adjustments to key structures would occur without my direct instruction. Follow-up meetings would be scheduled through his office, and only as needed. Each sentence tightened the frame a little more. Each sentence removed another assumption Vanessa had been living inside. By the end, even Daniel seemed to understand that there would be no gentle drift of authority toward whoever stood closest and spoke fastest. Martin gathered the documents into orderly stacks. Chairs shifted softly. Pens were capped. The ritual of conclusion began. Vanessa reached for her portfolio and finally said the one thing I had been waiting to hear, not because it would fix anything, but because it would reveal what remained when strategy ran out. "I did not realize," she said carefully, "that Thomas had put you in this position. In this position. Not trusted. Not protected. Not honored. Positioned. As if my marriage had been a placement exercise and not a 42-year partnership built room by room, account by account, loss by loss, loyalty by loyalty." I stood and slipped my gloves back on. "Thomas did not put me here," I said. "He recognized where I had always been." Then I lifted my handbag, thanked Martin for his time, and walked toward the door. No one tried to stop me. No one offered another careful phrase about support or practical realities. Behind me, the conference room remained full of polished wood, legal paper, and the stale remains of certainty. Ahead of me, the hallway was quiet, sunlit, and ordinary. I kept walking with the same steady pace I had carried into the funeral home days earlier. Except now the room I was leaving understood something the mourners had not. I was never the woman waiting to be managed. I was the one they should have been careful not to underestimate. When I stepped out of Martin's office, the air in the hallway felt different, lighter in temperature, but heavier in meaning, as though the building itself had witnessed enough family performances to recognize the end of one. The receptionist rose politely when she saw me, offering the kind of smile that belongs in places built on discretion. I returned it, thanked her, and walked outside into the clear cold of late morning. The sky had brightened while we were inside. Cars moved along the avenue in a clean stream of weekday purpose. A man in a navy overcoat hurried past with a coffee cup in one hand and a phone pressed to his ear. Somewhere farther down the block, a delivery truck idled at the curb. The world remained indecently ordinary, which I have found is one of the hardest truths about humiliation and grief. You expect the weather to acknowledge a wound. It never does. I reached my car and paused with my hand on the door. Behind the glass front of the office, I could still see the conference room windows reflecting sunlight. Somewhere in there, Daniel was likely sitting in the remains of his confusion, trying to decide whether to be angry at his wife, ashamed of himself, or wounded by his father. Vanessa was likely reorganizing the situation in her mind, already searching for a version of events in which she had merely been misunderstood, merely overhelpful, merely realistic. People who live by narrative rarely surrender it all at once. They revise. They edit. They move blame around until it lands somewhere flattering. But there are moments when revision fails because the original performance was witnessed too clearly, and I knew, as I stood there in my gloves and pearls beneath the pale Connecticut sun, that this was one of those moments. I drove home with the radio off and my thoughts unusually still. Not peaceful. Still. There is a difference. Peace suggests comfort, and I was nowhere near comfort. Thomas was still gone. His side of the bed would still be untouched that night. His coat would still hang in the hall closet. His reading glasses would still rest on the table beside his chair in the den, waiting for a hand that would never lift them again. Nothing Martin had said, nothing the documents confirmed, nothing Vanessa had been forced to hear changed the central fact of my life. The man I had loved for 42 years was dead. Money does not soften that. Control does not soothe it. Vindication does not warm an empty pillow. But what it does do, if used correctly, is clear a path through the fog other people try to build around your grief. By the time I turned into the drive, I already knew what I would do first. Not with the holdings. Not with the accounts. With the house. I walked through the front door, set my handbag down, and stood in the foyer beneath the chandelier that Thomas once said was the only extravagant thing in the house I had ever chosen without debate. I could almost hear his voice. "You liked it immediately," he had said. "That means I should be worried about the price." I had told him he was impossible. He had told me impossible men build very dependable retirement portfolios. We had laughed. I stood there for a long moment, then called for Mrs. Alvarez, who had helped us 3 mornings a week for the past 8 years, and had arrived quietly while I was gone. She came from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, concern softening her face the moment she saw mine. "Mrs. Carter," she said, "would you like some lunch?" "Not yet," I said, "but I would like one thing made very clear." She waited. Mrs. Alvarez had excellent instincts. She knew when a room required softness and when it required witness. "No one," I said, "discusses this house with anyone outside this home. No plans, no concerns, no speculation, no casual conversation with callers, relatives, or visitors. If anyone asks questions, they are referred to me." She nodded immediately. Of course. I thanked her, and that was that. Real loyalty often sounds simple. Later that afternoon, Daniel called. I let the first ring pass, then the second, then answered on the third. "Mom," he said, and his voice carried the rawness of a man who had spent several hours discovering that silence does not protect anyone from consequence. "I think we should talk." I looked out the library window at the bare trees edging the property. "We are talking," I said. He exhaled. "That is not what I meant." "I know." There was a pause. Vanessa did not handle this well. I almost laughed, though there was no humor in me. Did not handle this well. As if we were discussing seating at a fundraiser. No, I said. She did not. She was trying to help. No, Daniel. She was trying to position herself. And you allowed it because you hoped passivity would keep your hands clean. The silence on the line deepened. I imagined him standing in the kitchen of that large new house he and Vanessa had bought too quickly and furnished too expensively, one hand braced on the counter, the other clutching his phone, finally hearing himself named without cushioning. I did not think it would go this far, he said. That, I told him, is the problem with weak boundaries. Other people mistake them for permission. He said nothing. For the first time in years, I did not rush to rescue him from the discomfort. I let it stand between us, honest and unwelcome. At last he asked, what happens now? I had spent enough years answering that question for him. School decisions, job changes, debt problems, the wedding venue he could not afford but wanted anyway, the apartment lease he had signed too quickly. A mother can become a hallway through which an entire grown child keeps walking unless she learns, eventually, to become a door. Now, I said, you and your wife learn the difference between family and access. He drew in a slow breath. Are you shutting us out? No, I said. I am declining to be managed. After we hung up, I went into Thomas's study and sat at his desk for the first time since he died. The leather chair gave slightly beneath me. The room still smelled like cedar and paper and the clean cologne he used sparingly. I opened the drawer where we kept stationery and took out a cream card embossed with our address. In slow, careful handwriting, I made a list. Martin, trustee follow-up, household instructions, charitable review, personal inventory. Then, after a brief pause, I added one final line. Guest boundaries. I set the pen down and looked around the room. This was what people like Vanessa never understand. They think power reveals itself in the moment of announcement, in the number, in the gasp, in the legal phrase that changes everything. But real power had already been built long before that meeting. It lived in preparation, in memory, in patience, in knowing exactly where the documents were, exactly who had earned trust, exactly which silences were protective and which were cowardly. Thomas had understood that. So had I. The money mattered, yes. $28 million has a way of correcting the posture of a room. But money was never the whole story. The whole story was that they had looked at a grieving widow in a black dress and pearls and mistaken composure for dependence. They had heard quiet and assumed weakness. They had seen age and imagined decline. They had stood in a funeral home, beneath white flowers and polished sympathy, and treated me like a woman whose life would now be decided for her. And in the end, that was their real mistake. Not underestimating the amount. Underestimating the woman who had never needed to mention it at all.